What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Jared Speaks, episode 26. Grateful to be here as always. 26 consecutive episodes is something I am proud of, and none of it happens without you listening, so thank you. Today we're going somewhere I've been promising since episode 3. We touch on this briefly in the Mandela Effect episode. And again, we talked about the hard problem of consciousness. Today, we're giving it the full treatment it deserves. Today, we are talking about simulation theory. Here's a thought that I want you to sit with before we go anywhere. If you were living inside a perfectly constructed simulation, a computer-generated reality so detailed and seamless that every texture, every sound, every smell, every sensation felt completely and utterly real, how would you know? The honest answer is you probably would not know. Because a simulation is good enough to fool you completely. By definition, feel exactly like reality feels right now. Now here's where it gets interesting. Observation, which sounds like the beginning of a science fiction movie, is actually the starting point for one of the most seriously debated arguments in modern philosophy and physics, made not by screenwriters, but by a philosopher at Oxford, a physicist at MIT, and taken seriously enough that people like Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson have said publicly they think it is plausible. Today, we go all the way in. The argument, the evidence people point to, what real scientists and philosophers think, how it connects to everything this show has been building, and what it actually means for how you live if it turns out to be true. Before we go anywhere, I want to ground this in its real origin, because simulation theory is not just internet speculation or movie-inspired conspiracy thinking. It has a specific, serious academic core. In 2003, a philosopher named Nick Bostrom, working at Oxford University, published a paper with a deceptively simple title. Are you living in a computer simulation? Bostrom is not a fringe thinker. He's a serious academic philosopher who also works on questions about artificial intelligence and the long-term future of humanity. This paper became one of the most cited and most argued about pieces of academic philosophy in the last 20 years. Bostrom's argument is structured as what philosophers call a trilemma. He says one of the three things must be true, and he cannot tell us which one, but at least one of them has to be. Here they are. First possibility. Almost all of civilizations that reach a certain level of technological advancement go extinct before they ever develop the computing power to run detailed simulations of their history or conscious beings. Something stops them. War, environmental collapse, AI gone wrong, something. They get to a certain point and then they disappear. Second possibility. Almost all technologically advanced civilizations that do survive long enough to develop that computing power simply choose not to run those simulations. Maybe for ethnical reasons. Maybe for resource reasons. Maybe it just does not interest them. But for whatever reason, they do not do it. Third possibility, we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation right now. Here's why the logic forces one of those three. If a civilization does survive and does run simulations of conscious beings, they would almost certainly run an enormous number of them, many more simulated minds than real ones. So if we assume simulated civilizations are possible and that advanced civilizations would run them, then statistically speaking, the overwhelming majority of all minds that have ever existed would be simulated rather than real, which means any given mind, including yours, including mine, is far more likely to be simulated than not. That is the argument. And you don't have to agree with it, but it is hard to dismiss once you actually follow the logic through. I want to spend some time here because I think the credibility of who takes this idea seriously is worth knowing. Elon Musk, in a public conversation in 2016, said that the odds that we are in base reality, meaning not a simulation, are about 1 in a billion. That was not a throwaway comment. He reasons through Bostrom's logic and said the trajectory of video game technology alone, the speed at which simulated environments are becoming indistinguishable from reality, makes it almost mathematically inevitable that simulations would eventually be good enough to fool the people inside them. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, and probably the most widely recognized science communicator alive, said at a conference that he thinks the simulation hypothesis is more likely than not. He pointed to the gap between human and chimpanzee intelligence. Despite being so genetically close, the difference in cognitive ability is enormous, and said that if beings exist with the same kind of advantage over us that we have over chimps, we might not even be able to understand the nature of reality they could create. Max Tegmark, a physicist at MIT, has spent decades developing what he calls the mathematical universe hypothesis. The idea that the universe is not just described by mathematics, the way a map describes a territory, but that the universe is literally mathematics. That physical reality, at its most fundamental level, is a mathematical structure. That idea, while not the same as simulation theory, points in the same direction. That reality at its core has more in common with information and structure than with solid physical stuff. Now, I want to be careful here because some of what people point to as evidence for simulation theory is genuinely interesting, and some of it is more speculative than it sounds. I'm going to give you both and tell you which is which. The genuinely interesting stuff first. The physical universe appears to be fundamentally mathematical, not just described by mathematics, actually built from it. Every law of physics can be expressed as a mathematical equation. The constants of nature, the numbers that determine how strong gravity is, how fast light travels, how particles interact, appear to be precisely tuned in a way that allows complex structures like atoms, stars, planets, and life to exist. Change any of them slightly, and the universe either collapses in on itself or blows apart before anything interesting can form. Whether that tuning is evidence of a simulation, a creator, pure luck, or something we do not have the right framework to understand yet is genuinely debated. There's also something called the Planck-length, the smallest meaningful unit of physical space, smaller than which the concept of distance stops making sense by our physical laws. Some physicists and simulation theorists have pointed to this as potentially analogous to a pixel, a minimum resolution below which the simulation does not render anything. I want to be clear that this is not an established scientific claim. It's a speculation. Physicists have other reasons for why the Planck length exists that have nothing to do with pixels. But the comparison gets made, and it is worth knowing about. Similarly, some people have pointed to the speed of light as potential analogous to a processing speed limit, the maximum rate at which information in the simulation can be updated. Again, mainstream physics has explanations for why the speed of light is what it is that do not require this interpretation. But the observation that reality seems to have a built-in speed limit that nothing can exceed is interesting in this context. The more genuinely puzzling thing from a physics standpoint is something called the observer effect in quantum mechanics. At the subatomic level, particles do not have definite properties until they are measured or observed. An electron does not have a positive or a definite position until something interacts with it and forces it to take one. Before that, it exists in what is called a superposition, a kind of probability cloud of where it could be. The active observation of measurement collapses that probability into an actual outcome. Reality at the quantum level appears to be, in some sense, not fully defined until it is looked at. That is not simulation theory. That is established, experimentally verified quantum mechanics. But it is the kind of finding that makes thoughtful people ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of what we call reality. If the universe only fully resolves itself when it is observed, that has a certain resemblance of how a simulation might work, only rendering what is being looked at in detail, leaving everything else as kind of a background blur until attention lands on it. Here's where this ties directly into earlier episodes of the show. And I want to make this connection explicitly because I think it's one of the most interesting things about where these ideas land. In episode 3, the Mandela Effect episode, we talked about the theory that the Mandela Effect, where large numbers of people share memories of things that the historical record says never happened, could be evidence of a timeline shift or a glitch, a moment where the simulation got patched and some people retained memory from the previous version. In episode 7, the déjà vu episode, we talked about the simulation theory explanation for that feeling of having lived a moment before. That déjà vu could be a processing error, a moment where the rendering glitched and played the same frame twice. In episode 9, the synchronicities episode, we talked about moments that line up too perfectly to feel like coincidence. From a simulation theory perspective, those moments could be the underlying code expressing a pattern that the surface level simulation is just reflecting. None of that proves simulation theory, but it gives you a framework, a set of questions to ask about experiences that otherwise do not have clean explanations. What if some of the things that feel like they are pointing at something more are pointing at the structure underneath the simulation? The same way a bug in a video game can reveal the code underneath the graphics. I want to be fair here and give you the skeptical case, because simulation theory has serious critics and they make real arguments. The physicist Sabine Hossenfelder, who is a serious researcher in quantum gravity and foundations of physics, has written critically about simulation theory. Her main argument is that for a simulation to work, it would have to be implemented in some physical substrate, some hardware somewhere. And that hardware would itself be subject to physical laws. So you have not actually explained anything. You have just pushed the explanation back one level. Whatever is running the simulation still needs to be explained. And now you need a theory of that level of reality too. It is an infinite regress problem. There is also the question of computational resources. Simulating a universe with the level of detail our universe appears to have, down to the interactions of some subatomic particles across the entire history of time and the entire expanse of space, would require computational power that is, by any reasonable estimate, almost incomprehensibly large. Even granting that a sufficiently advanced civilization might have resources we cannot imagine. The question of whether those resources could actually be sufficient is genuinely unclear. And there is a philosophical point that simulation theory, while unfalsifiable in principle, there may be no experiment we could run that would definitely prove or disprove it. Maybe also not be meaningful in the way that it first appears. If the simulation is perfect and complete, with consistent physical laws and no way to detect the boundary between simulation and whatever is outside, then in what practical sense is it a simulation rather than just reality? The label may not change anything that actually matters. These are real objections. I am not dismissing them. Simulation theory is an interesting idea that smart people take seriously, and other smart people think it is ultimately not as profound as it sounds. I want to sit here for a few minutes because I think this is the angle that gets underplayed in most simulation theory conversations. Across almost every major religious tradition, there is some version of the idea that the world we experience is not the deepest level of reality, that there is something more fundamental underneath or behind what we see. In Hinduism, the concept of Maya describes the material world as kind of a illusion, a veil over a deeper reality. The physical world we experience is real in a relative sense, but not in the ultimate reality, which is Brahman, the underlying consciousness or being from which everything arises. In Buddhism, the emphasis of the impermanence and constructed nature of all phenomena points in a similar direction. What we experience as solid, real, and permanent is actually a flux of interdependent processes that we project a false solidity onto. In certain strains of Christian and Jewish mystical thought, the physical world is understood as kind of a lower level of creation, a shadow or reflection of a more fundamental spiritual reality that underlies it. Plato's allegory of the cave, one of the most famous images in all of Western philosophy, describes people chained in a cave watching shadows on a wall, mistaking those shadows for reality, while the actual source of those shadows exists behind them in a world of light they cannot see. I'm not saying any of these traditions we're describing computer simulation in modern sense. Obviously, they were not. But the recurring intuition across thousands of years of human inquiry that the reality we experience might be a kind of secondary or constructed layer or something more fundamental that is striking. And simulation theory is, in a way, just the latest and most technically specific expression of that very old intuition. I want to end the main content of this episode with the question that I think actually matters most. Not is it true, but if it is true, does it change anything about how you live? Here is my honest answer. I do not think it should. And here's why. Whether you are a simulation or not, your experiences are real. Your relationships are real. The love you feel, the grief that you carry, the growth you have done, and the moments that you have lived. None of that becomes less real if the substrate running it turns out to be computational rather than physical in the way we assumed. The simulation, if that is what it is is generating real experiences for real conscious beings. Whatever is happening at the level of the code, what you are living is not a lesser version of reality. It is your reality. It is the only reality you have direct access to. What simulation theory can do, if you let it, is loosen your grip on certainty, on the assumption that you fully understand what reality is, what it is made of, what is possible within it. That loosening is actually useful, not as a reason to disengage from life or to decide nothing matters, as a reason to hold your assumptions more gently, to stay curious about the nature of things, to not dismiss experiences that do not fit the standard picture just because they do not fit. That is the same spirit this show has been running on from the beginning. Stay curious. Keep the question open. The moment you decide you fully understand what is real and what is not, that is when you stop seeing clearly. I want to know where you land on this one. Does simulation theory feel plausible to you when you really sit with the argument? Or does it feel like a clever idea that ultimately does not hold up? And if you do think we might be in a simulation, does that change anything for you about how you live your life? Drop it in the comments. I think this one is going to split people pretty cleanly, and I want to hear both sides. That is episode 26, everybody. We teased this topic in episode 3, and I'm glad we finally gave it the full conversation it deserved. Whether we are in a simulation or not, the question it raises about the nature of reality, the limits of what we can know, and the deep strangeness of the universe we find ourselves in are worth sitting with. Follow the show on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. Leave a rating if you can. Share this with somebody who likes to have their assumptions rattled a little. New episode tomorrow. Stay curious, take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you then.